Shalom, welcome back, and we are continuing on with our study on the Hyksos, also known as the Amalekites, and we're going to look at some further connections to prove this link. Again, all this information is coming from Emanuel Velikovsky's book, Ages and Chaos. We are in chapter 2, and we are just going over some of these connections from the Arabian historians, or a lot of these guys are like the Muslim historians. We think of Muslims today as these very primitive and warlike people, but there was actually a kind of a golden age of Islam where they were educated, and they were not what they are today. Unfortunately, much of Western society is very ignorant of that, but they were actually a fairly intelligent society at one point. Okay, so many ancient Arab writers recorded the invasion of Egypt by the Amalekites. There is a great deal of fancy in some of these stories. In several instances, they are spoiled by the clumsy attempts of these authors to adapt their Arab traditions to the tradition of the Hebrews, but not to the correct ones. So it happens that Joseph was sold into Egypt when an Amalekite was the Pharaoh, or that Moses left Egypt when an Amalekite was the Pharaoh. An Arab author admitted that there was no concurrence as to the race of the Pharaoh who reigned at the time of Moses, whether he was a Copt, a Syrian, or an Amalekite. And so this is important because it shows that the traditions of the Arab writers was that there were Amalekite pharaohs in Egypt at one point. He says, we shall disregard these attempts of some Arabian authors to insert stories culled from the biblical narrative and stories indigenous to the Arabian Peninsula, and we shall devote our attention only to the narratives which did not have their source in the Bible or the Haggadah. They must have been autochthonias and transmitted from generation to generation on the Arabian Peninsula. There it was told that Syria and Egypt came simultaneously under domination of the Amalekites, who escaped from Arabia when it was visited by a plague of insects, drought and famine, an earthquake, and a flood at Safa and Tahama. An important historical moment is revealed in the sequence. A natural catastrophe composed of many significant phenomena was the cause of the hurried migration of the Amalekites towards Syria and Egypt. So again, you see this same pattern of upheaval in the form of an earthquake or worldwide hurricane or famine and drought, all these plagues that happened at the same time that the Amalekites were driven out of Arabia, and also when Egypt was destroyed. So the premise is that these were all the same event, that the plagues and the cataclysm did not just affect Egypt, but the entire ancient Near East. The Arabian traditions that have survived to our time are written down by authors of the 9th to the 14th centuries that refer to these ancient traditions, and also to older authors, sometimes naming them. So again, this 9th to the 14th century is what I refer to as this like kind of golden age in Islam, back before they turned into this bloodthirsty mob that we have today. So after the Amalekites invaded Syria and Egypt, they established a dynasty of their pharaohs. Al-Samhudi, 844 to 911, wrote, "The Amalekites reached Syria and Egypt and took possession of these lands, and the tyrants of Syria and the pharaohs of Egypt were of their origin." So here is this tradition related from the Arab writers that there were Amalekite pharaohs in Egypt. Masudi, who wrote about the plagues that befell Arabia and the flight of the Amalekites from Mecca and the flood, recounted also the conquest of Egypt by the Amalekites. An Amalekite king, El-Walid, son of Duma, arrived from Syria, invaded Egypt and conquered it, seized the throne and occupied it without opposition his life long. We are reminded of the words of Manetho, previously quoted, of a people of ignoble origin from the east, whose coming was unforeseen, and had the audacity to invade the country, which they mastered by main force without difficulty or even a battle. So here you see it's kind of lining up with the same testimony. In another work of his, Masudi gives a more detailed account of the conquest of El-Walid. It says, El-Walid, son of Duma, advanced at the head of a numerous army with the intention to overrun diverse countries and to overthrow their sovereigns. The end of this passage recalls the sentence in the Haggadah that Amalek, in his wantonness, undertook to destroy the whole world. Masudi continues, when this conqueror came to Syria, he heard rumors about Egypt. He sent there one of his servants named Una with a great host of warriors. El-Walid oppressed the inhabitants, seized their possessions, and drew forth all the treasures he could find. Masudi tells of strife among the Amalekites and of the invasion of Egypt by a second wave of people led by Al-Khan, surnamed Abu Kabus. The Amalekites entered Egypt, destroyed many monuments and objects of art. The Amalekites invaded Egypt, the frontier of which they had already crossed, and started to ravage the country, to smash the objects of art, and to ruin the monuments. So these words recall those of Manetho as cited by Josephus in Against Apion and quoted above, that the Hyksos savagely burned the cities, razed the temples of the gods to the ground, and treated the whole native population with the utmost cruelty. So you can see that all of these traditions and all of these writings kind of coincide. The words of Masudi accord with the mention of the destruction of monuments in the inscription of King Hatshepsut, a ruler of the 18th dynasty. In this inscription, referred to on a previous page, it is said there had been Amu in the midst of the delta, and in Haur or Arius, and the foreign hordes of their number had destroyed the ancient works, and they reigned ignorant of the god Ra. So, again, it's just all kind of different versions of the same story. Tabari related stories and legends of Amalekite pharaohs and gave their genealogies. The following sentence is characteristic. Then the king of Egypt died, and another king, his relative, ascended to the throne. He was also the Amalekite race and was named Kabos, son of Masab, son of Mauya, son of Namir, son of Salwaz, son of Amro, and son of Amalek. Abulfeda, in his history of pre-Islamic Arabia, wrote, there were Egyptian pharaohs of the Amalekite descent. He also mentioned a most violent tempest that had swept Egypt in remote days. He gave the names of a succession of Amalekite pharaohs and told of the dominion of Syria by the Amalekites. Ibn Abd al-Hakam cited that Yakut and other names could be added to the authors quoted here, but those given suffice to demonstrate that the tradition of the Amalekite dynasties of pharaohs was spread among the Arabian scholars. So he's saying, that there's other people you could mention, but I guess for brevity's sake, he's just going to state that they all kind of agree with one another. He says the historical background of their stories about Amalekite pharaohs in Egypt was regarded with distrust. There were scholars who took an even more radical viewpoint and asserted that the Amalekites had never existed. They based their conclusion on the assumption that the name of the Amalek tribe was never mentioned in Egyptian inscriptions. On the other hand, an equally extreme viewpoint doubted the very fact of the invasion of Egypt by the Hyksos and interpreted it as a story of legendary origin. The Hyksos were supposed to be just another dynasty of native rulers. The Amalekites were presumably not known by the Egyptian people. The Hyksos were equally unknown to other peoples. Therefore, the historical existence of one or the other was sometimes doubted. And of course, the irony is that they were both speaking about the same group of people. So the Hyksos rule in Egypt endured through all the time that elapsed between the Middle Kingdom and the New Kingdom. The text of the Papyrus Ipuwer was composed at the time of the invasion of the Hyksos, and it refers to this invasion. The expulsion of the Hyksos and the period immediately preceding it are also described in some contemporaneous documents, but the period between the invasion and the expulsion is very poor in records. It is a dark age in two senses. Manetho is a late source in the dominance and expulsion of the Hyksos. About 1,000 years separated the historian from his subject. He provides the information that after the Hyksos invaded the country, destroying, burning, and raping and ravaging, they established a dynasty of Hyksos pharaohs, and that the first of these kings, named Salitis or Salatis, resided in Memphis and extracted tribute from Upper and Lower Egypt, and left garrisons in the places most suited for defense. In particular, he secured his eastern flank to protect the realm from the north, as he foresaw that the Assyrians, as their power increased in the future, would covet and attack his realm. There, to the east of the delta, King Salitis discovered a favorably situated place called Aris, a strategic point from which to control both Egypt and Syria. He rebuilt and strongly fortified it with walls and established a garrison there, numbering as many as 240,000 armed men to protect his frontier. This place he used to visit every summer, partially to serve out rations and pay it to his troops, partially to give them a careful training and maneuvers in order to intimidate foreigners. The fourth king is called Apophis by Manetho, and he is said to have ruled for 61 years. The first 6 king shepherds are considered the first Hyksos dynasty of pharaohs. In Manetho Josephus, it is said of them, the continuously growing ambition of these 6, their first rulers, was to extirpate the Egyptian people. The ruler of the Hyksos was cruel. They knew no mercy. Substantiation of this may be found even in graves. The excavator of one of the smaller garrison fortresses of the Hyksos thus described the contents of a grave. It was a heap of bones stacked closely together. Most of them were animals, but among them I found a piece of human jaw and patella. In another grave, he found an apparently separated arm and a superfluous loose hand. So, these Hyksos were cruel to the point that they would cut off members of people that fell into ill repute with them, and would just throw their bones in with the graves of animals. When we remember what Manetho said about the extreme cruelty of the invaders and compare it with the Hebrew narratives about the Amalekites mutilating their prisoners by cutting off members of the body, the finding of an odd hand or jaw does not seem an accidental occurrence. The garrison fortresses were places of torture. And of course, just like I mentioned in the previous videos, this same spirit of wickedness that comes from Mecca and Medina. The dominion of the Amu Hyksos was not confined to Egypt. Scarabs or official seals have been found in various countries with the names of King Apop and King Kion. The name of Kion is engraved in a sphinx discovered in Baghdad, and on a jar lid found at Knossos in Crete. An inscription of Apop says that Iris, father Seth, lord of Aris, has set all foreign countries under his feet, and Aris was the sacrarium of Seth, whom the Hyksos worshipped, and who, until the time of the Ramessides, was regarded by the Egyptians as a personification of the dark power, the contester of Isis and Horus, or equivalent with the Greek Typhon. So essentially, if you could think of like Seth being the god of the underworld, or what we would think of as Satan. That's who the Amalekites worshipped, according to this. The finding in distant countries of objects bearing the name of Apop and Kion seems to prove that Apop's words were no vain boast. Some historians have found themselves compelled to believe that the Hyksos, if only for a transient period, commanded a very great empire, and that at least the area of political influence of the Amu Hyksos was very extensive. The last Hyksos dynasty, the 17th Egyptian dynasty, according to Manetho, was a dynasty of shepherds and Theban kings, meaning that in Thebes there was princes of Egyptian nationalities subordinate to the Hyksos pharaohs. The last of these Hyksos pharaohs was Apop II, also a prominent king. Okay, so this is, I guess, a short video. So this gives you some more details from the point of view of the Arab historians on the Amalekites dwelling in Egypt and being of the line of pharaohs. So so now we're going to get more into some more information we have about the Amalekites and how they ruled the ancient Near East and how far their rule extended in the next video. I thank you for listening. Shalom, and we'll continue this later. Thanks.